Hi there. I am so happy you found your way to Starlet Sinister tonight. I know you are here to escape the noise, so here is my promise. Only few short ads in the first 10 minutes, but after that, silence. The rest of the video is completely ad-free so you can sleep undisturbed. I've dug deep to bring you fresh stories that you won't find anywhere else. I wanted to bring you something real. If that sounds good to you, a sub would help me a lot. Before you close your eyes, let me know one thing in the comments. What is the weather like outside your window right now? I love imagining where you all are listening from. Now, get comfortable. Let the dark in. Here is story number 1. I have trouble explaining when it began because my early memories don't follow time in a clean way. They sit in my head like old photographs that were left out in the sun too long. The edges are faded, and the middle feels warm and wrong. I know I was very young, small enough that the world still felt too big for my hands. When I think back, 2 houses always come first, even though my family lived in more places than that. I don't remember addresses or street signs. I only remember how they felt. In my mind, they are just the brown house and the blue house. Most people talk about their childhood homes with a kind of comfort in their voice. Mine never come with that feeling. When I picture those places, my shoulders tighten without me meaning to. It's the same quiet reaction I get when a room goes silent too suddenly. I've spent years telling myself this is just memory playing tricks. Kids imagine things. Kids feel fear more loudly. But even now, decades later, the feeling that comes with those houses hasn't softened. The brown house comes first. I couldn't tell you my exact age, but I know I was small enough that the floor felt cold through my clothes. I remember sitting in my bedroom with my back against the wall. The room wasn't dark, but the light felt thin, like it was being pulled away from the corners. I had a blanket wrapped around me. It was red, with a pattern I loved because it made me feel protected. I held it close to my face and rocked slightly, the way children do when they don't understand why they're upset. I wasn't hurt. I wasn't sick. I just felt wrong. The air in the room felt heavier than it should have. The sounds from the rest of the house were far away, as if someone had shut a door between me and the world. I remember calling out for my parents. My voice sounded small to my own ears. When no one answered, that tight feeling in my chest grew stronger. I stared at the foot of my bed, not because I expected to see anything there, but because something in me didn't want to look anywhere else. That was when I noticed the shape. It didn't appear suddenly. It was more like realizing a piece of furniture had always been in the room, just outside of where you'd been looking. The shape stood near the bed, tall enough that it didn't fit the space properly. I couldn't make out details. My eyes kept sliding off it, the way they do when you stare at something too bright. What stayed with me wasn't what it looked like, but how it made the room feel smaller. I remember my hands tightening in the blanket. My breathing slowed, not because I was calm, but because something inside me told me to be still. The shape didn't rush. It didn't reach out. It simply existed closer than it should have, close enough that I could sense warmth where there shouldn't have been any. The air near it felt dry, like standing too close to something that had been left on too long. I don't remember falling or being lifted. I remember pressure, light but undeniable, like someone leaning too close into your space. My throat felt tight, not in pain, but in a way that made swallowing hard. I tried to make noise again, but my body didn't cooperate. The room felt very quiet, and then suddenly very empty. The next clear memory is being on the floor, wrapped in my blanket, breathing too fast. The shape was gone. The room looked normal again, but it didn't feel safe. I stayed where I was until the light outside the window changed, and footsteps finally came down the hall. I didn't tell my parents what happened. I didn't know how. I only knew that saying it out loud felt dangerous. We moved not long after that. The blue house should have felt like a fresh start. It had a yard and brighter walls. My parents seemed happier there. For a while, I let myself believe that whatever had followed me in the brown house had been left behind. I slept better. I laughed more. I started to feel like a normal kid again. The basement was the only place that never fit. It sat beneath the house like a long-held breath. The stairs were narrow, and the light never reached the far end properly. My uncle lived down there. He kept to himself and didn't cause problems, but there was something careful about the way he moved, like someone used to not being seen. I didn't spend time in the basement unless I had to. One afternoon, he told me not to open his door. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten me. He just looked at me for a long moment before heading upstairs. His hand stayed on the door frame as if he was thinking about something else he wanted to say. Then he told me to stay where I was until he came back. I nodded, already curious in the way children always are when someone gives them a rule without a reason. The hallway felt longer than usual when his footsteps faded. The air down there felt cooler, but not in a comforting way. I remember standing in front of his door, my hand hovering before touching the handle. The metal felt colder than it should have. I turned it slowly. The room beyond didn't look right. It wasn't filled with things the way bedrooms usually are. It felt open in a way that made my stomach drop. The corners seemed too far apart. The light from the hallway didn't travel far inside. I didn't step over the threshold. I didn't need to. Something in the room had already noticed me. The darkness inside shifted. It gathered itself without moving fast. I didn't see a face. I didn't see eyes. What I noticed was height and shape, and the sense of something standing upright where nothing should have been. It began to move toward the door, not with urgency, but with patience. That was enough. I closed the door and ran. I don't remember what I said when I reached the kitchen, only that my voice shook. My uncle listened without interrupting. When I finished, he told me I'd imagined it. His voice was calm, but his eyes avoided mine. He didn't go back downstairs right away. That stayed with me longer than anything else. After that, I avoided the basement. I learned the paths through the house that kept me as far from the stairs as possible. At night, I listened for sounds I didn't understand. Nothing followed me upstairs. Nothing appeared in my room. But the knowledge that something remained below never left. As I grew older, the memories shifted. They started to mix. The brown house and the blue house blended together in my dreams. I would walk down one hallway and end up in the other. Doors led to places that didn't belong to them. The feeling was always the same. I was small again. The air was wrong again. I would wake with my heart racing, my throat tight, convinced that something had been very close. I stopped talking about it. People don't like stories without explanations. They want clear shapes and reasons. I couldn't give them that. I learned to keep my fears quiet and my rooms well lit. I built my adult life around avoiding narrow spaces and dark corners. It worked mostly, until it didn't. Last week, during a storm, the power went out in my building. I stood in my kitchen, listening to the rain hit the windows. The quiet that followed the outage felt familiar in a way I didn't like. The air cooled too quickly. My chest tightened before my mind caught up. I didn't see anything clearly. What I noticed was the space near the refrigerator feeling occupied when it shouldn't have been. The same sense of warmth, the same pressure in the room. I didn't wait to understand it. I grabbed my keys and left. I haven't gone back yet. I'm writing this in places with people and light. I don't know if what I've carried all these years lives in houses, or in memories, or in me. I only know that it waits for stillness. It waits for comfort, and I don't feel ready to give it either. The sun is going down now, and I'm watching shadows stretch across the floor. I'm trying not to think about how familiar they feel. Story number 2. I had always been the kind of person who laughed at ghost stories. Growing up, I loved horror movies and spooky books, but I never truly believed that anything was waiting for us in the dark. To me, ghosts were just a way for people to make sense of old, creaky houses and the tricks that shadows can play on your eyes. When I started my YouTube channel to talk about nightmares and sleep, I looked at everything through the lens of science. I thought every haunting had a logical explanation, like wind in the attic or old pipes. But a few months ago, I decided to do something that would prove me wrong in the most terrifying way possible. There is a house in my town that everyone stays away from. It sits at the end of a long, gravel driveway, mostly hidden by overgrown trees and tangled vines. The local legends say that something dark happened there decades ago, and since then, no one has been able to stay in the house for more than a few days. People talk about seeing lights in the windows when the power is off and hearing voices coming from the empty porch. I thought it was all just talk. So I reached out to the current owner and if I could spend a single night there alone to film a video. I wanted to show my viewers that there was nothing to be afraid of. When I first pulled up to the house, the sun was just starting to set. The building looked tired, with peeling white paint and windows that looked like empty, staring eyes. As I stepped onto the porch, the air felt different. It wasn't just cold, it was heavy, like the atmosphere you feel right before a massive thunderstorm hits. I let myself in with the key the owner had left under a loose floorboard. The inside of the house smelled like dust and old paper. I set up my sleeping bag in the main bedroom on the second floor, telling myself that any noises I heard were just the house settling as the temperature dropped. At the time, it felt normal to be a little nervous. Anyone would be jumpy in a strange, dark house. I spent the first few hours checking my camera gear and walking through the rooms with a flashlight. Everything was quiet. I didn't see any ghosts or hear any screams. By midnight, I was actually starting to feel bored. I climbed into my sleeping bag and turned off my main light, leaving just a small lantern glowing in the corner. I closed my eyes, thinking about how I was going to edit the video to make it look scarier than it actually was. I drifted off to sleep feeling pretty confident. That's when things changed. I woke up a few hours later, but I didn't open my eyes right away. I stayed still, listening to the house. The wind had picked up outside, and I could hear the branches of the trees scratching against the siding. But then, I heard something else. It was the distinct sound of footsteps coming from the hallway. They weren't the random creaks of old wood. They were rhythmic and heavy, moving slowly toward my bedroom door. I felt a surge of adrenaline, thinking that someone had broken into the house. I tried to sit up, but my body wouldn't move. It was a feeling I had never experienced before. It felt like my limbs had been turned into lead. I tried to lift my arm to grab my flashlight, but I couldn't even wiggle my fingers. I tried to call out, to tell whoever was there to get out, but my throat was tight and no sound came out. My heart was thudding so hard in my chest that I could feel the vibration in my ears. I realized I was experiencing sleep paralysis, something I had researched many times before. I told myself to stay calm, that my brain was just waking up faster than my muscles. I told myself it would pass in a minute. But then the door to the bedroom slowly creaked open. A blast of ice, cold air swept into the room, making the flame of my lantern flicker and dance. From the corner of my eye, I saw a shape move into the room. It was a tall, thin shadow, darker than the rest of the darkness. It didn't have a face, just a smooth, black surface where a head should be. It walked to the foot of my bed and just stood there, staring down at me. Even though it didn't have eyes, I could feel its gaze burning into me. The fear was so intense that it felt like a physical weight pressing down on my lungs. I stared at the figure, praying for the paralysis to break. Every second felt like an hour. The shadow didn't move or make a sound. It just existed there, filling the room with a sense of pure, cold malice. I started to hear whispers then, not in the room, but inside my head. They were overlapping voices, speaking a language I didn't recognize, their tones rising and falling like a chant. I felt like I was being watched by 1,000 eyes from the darkness behind the tall shadow. I wanted to scream, to cry, to do anything to break the silence, but I was a prisoner in my own skin. The shadowy figure stood at the foot of my bed for what felt like an eternity. I kept trying to blink, hoping that when my eyes opened again, the room would be empty and the sun would be shining. But every time I looked, the darkness was still there, looming over me. The whispers in my head were getting louder now, turning into a low hum that vibrated in my teeth. I felt a cold pressure on my chest, as if someone was kneeling on me, pushing the air out of my lungs. I was convinced that I was going to die in that old house, and that my camera would be the only witness to whatever was happening to me. That's when things changed in the atmosphere of the room. The lantern in the corner, which had been glowing steadily, suddenly went out. The room was plunged into total blackness, but I could still see the outline of the figure, because it was even darker than the night. It started to lean forward, its long, thin arms reaching out toward my face. I could smell something old and metallic, like rusted iron or wet earth. Just as its fingers were about to touch my skin, I felt a sharp, electric jolt snap through my body. My fingers twitched, and suddenly I could move again. I didn't think much of my pride in that moment. I scrambled out of my sleeping bag, knocking over the lantern and fumbling for my flashlight. I clicked it on and swung the beam toward the foot of the bed, but the room was empty. The door was still standing open, and the hallway beyond was silent. I didn't stay to investigate or look for footprints. I grabbed my car keys and my camera bag and ran down the stairs, nearly tripping over my own feet in my rush to get out. I burst through the front door and didn't stop running until I was inside my car with the doors locked. I sat in the driveway with the engine running, my hands shaking so hard I could barely grip the steering wheel. I looked back at the house, and for a split second, I saw a pale face watching me from the upstairs window. It wasn't the shadow figure. It looked like a person, staring down with an expression of deep sadness. I didn't wait to see more. I threw the car into reverse and sped away, the gravel crunching loudly under my tires. I didn't stop driving until I reached a brightly lit gas station 5 miles away. Looking back, I realized that my scientific explanations didn't cover everything I felt that night. I knew about sleep paralysis, and I knew how the brain can create hallucinations when it is under a lot of stress. But the cold breeze and the smell of the room were too real to be just a trick of the mind. When I got home and checked the footage from my camera, the screen was mostly black, but the audio was terrifying. You could hear the sound of the door opening, and then a strange, rhythmic tapping that lasted for 10 minutes. It sounded like someone tapping their fingernails against the wooden bed frame right next to my head. I never uploaded that video to my channel. I didn't want to give that house any more attention, and I didn't want to relive the experience by editing the footage. I ended up deleting the files and putting the camera in a drawer for a month. My friends asked me how the night went, and I just told them it was boring and that nothing happened. I lied because I didn't want to admit that I was still afraid. I didn't want them to know that I had started sleeping with a lamp on and that I checked the hallway 5 times every night before getting into bed. I fear the future because I don't know if that shadow stayed in the house. A few weeks after my stay, I started noticing things in my own apartment. I would find doors open that I knew I had closed, and sometimes I would wake up in the middle of the night feeling that same heavy pressure on my chest. It wasn't as intense as it was in the haunted house, but it was enough to remind me that I had invited something into my life by being too curious. I wonder if some places are haunted because of the people who visited them, carrying the darkness home like a burr stuck to a coat. I still don't know who that pale face in the window belonged to. I searched through old records of the house and found that a young man had lived there alone in the 50s. He had been a writer who rarely left the house, and one day the neighbors noticed he hadn't been seen for weeks. They found him in that upstairs bedroom, having passed away in his sleep. Some say he was terrified of the dark and always kept a lantern burning by his bed. I wonder if he was the one trying to warn me, or if he was just another prisoner of whatever lives in that hallway. I don't go to haunted houses anymore, and I don't try to prove people wrong about their local legends. I've learned that some stories exist for a reason, and that fear is a tool our bodies use to keep us away from things we aren't meant to understand. The world is full of old buildings and quiet woods, and most of them are perfectly safe. But every now and then, you find a place that feels like it's holding its breath. If you ever find yourself in a house like that, don't wait for the shadows to start moving. Just leave. The sun is starting to come up now, and the birds are beginning to chirp outside. It's the time of day when I finally feel like I can turn off the lights and get some real rest. But as I close my eyes, I still find myself listening to the hallway, waiting to see if I hear the sound of bare feet on the hardwood. I hope that tonight is a quiet night. I hope that whatever I saw in that house has finally found someone else to watch. I stay away from the end of that gravel driveway now. I heard that the house was sold recently to a young couple who wanted to fix it up and turn it into a bed and breakfast. I thought about sending them a message, telling them to check the floorboards and keep the lights on, but I decided against it. Maybe for them, it will just be a normal house. Maybe the shadows only come out for people who go looking for them. I hope they never find the key under the porch. Story number 3. I have a hard time remembering a lot of things from when I was 10, but this one night is burned into my brain like a bright light. It was a Tuesday, just a normal school night in the middle of a warm month. I remember waking up in the middle of the night because I had to use the bathroom. The house was quiet, and the only sound was the low hum of the refrigerator in the next room. I got up, did what I had to do, and walked back toward my bedroom. For some reason, I didn't shut my door all the way. I left it standing open just a crack, letting a tiny bit of light from the hallway hit the floor. My bedroom was set up in a way that the door led directly into the kitchen area. I climbed back into bed and pulled the sheets up to my chin, feeling that heavy, comfortable weight of sleep starting to pull at my eyes. I was right on the edge of drifting off, that weird time where your thoughts start to turn into dreams. I happened to glance through the open door, looking into the dark kitchen. In the shadows near the counter, I saw something that made my heart stop. There was a figure standing there, glowing with a faint, sickly green light. At the time, it felt normal to think I was just seeing things. I blinked, expecting the shape to turn back into a chair or a pile of laundry, but it didn't disappear. It was a tall, thin figure, and its body looked wrong in a way I can't quite put into words. Its skin seemed to shimmer with that green tint, and I noticed its hands were long and deformed, with fingers that looked like they had too many joints. It didn't move. It just stood there in the middle of my kitchen, perfectly still, as if it was waiting for me to notice it. That's when things changed in my head. I didn't scream, and I didn't run. I was too terrified to even move a muscle. I watched it for maybe 2 or 3 seconds, which felt like a lifetime, and then it was just gone. It didn't walk away or fade out. It just wasn't there anymore. I dived under my covers, pulling the blanket over my head until I was breathing in nothing but my own warm air. My mind was racing with questions that a 10-year-old shouldn't have to ask. I wondered if it was an alien or some kind of monster that had come to take me away. I lay there in the dark, wondering if it was bad or if it was just lost. I kept waiting for the sound of the kitchen floorboards creaking, or for the feeling of those deformed hands grabbing my blanket. I was so scared that my whole body was shaking, but somehow I eventually fell asleep. I don't know how I managed to drift off while a green monster was potentially standing 5 feet away. But when I opened my eyes again, the sun was shining through my window. The kitchen was empty, the green light was gone, and everything looked completely normal. Looking back, I try to find a logical reason for what I saw. Maybe it was just stress from school, or maybe my brain was playing a trick on me because I was so tired. But the image of that green figure is so clear that I can still see the way it stood in the shadows. I've had dreams before, and I've had nightmares, but those always feel fuzzy when you wake up. This memory hasn't faded at all. It stays with me, a sharp and cold reminder that sometimes the things we see in the dark are more than just imagination. I never told my parents about the green man in the kitchen. I figured they would just tell me I was having a bad dream or that I had watched too many sci-fi movies. I kept it to myself, but for years afterward, I never slept with my bedroom door open again. I would check the kitchen 3 times before going to bed, making sure every light was off and every door was locked. Even now, as an adult, I find myself glancing into dark rooms and expecting to see that faint green glow waiting for me in the corner. I fear the future because I still don't know if that thing ever left. I wonder if it's still wandering through houses at night, stopping for just a few seconds to look at sleeping children before moving on. I wonder if it was looking for something specific, or if I was just the first person to catch it while it was passing through. The world is a much bigger and stranger place than we like to admit, and I think there are things living right alongside us that we only see when our guard is down. I still don't know what those deformed hands were meant for. I think about the way it stood so quietly, and it makes me wonder if it had been there before, watching me sleep on other nights when I didn't wake up. I find myself researching stories of green figures and strange visitors, looking for anyone else who saw what I saw. Most of the stories I find are about lights in the sky or gray aliens, but nothing ever quite matches the specific, indescribable look of the thing in my kitchen. I don't leave my door open anymore, even when the house is hot. I've learned that the darkness is a lot more crowded than it looks, and that some visitors don't need an invitation to come inside. If you ever wake up in the middle of the night and feel like someone is watching you from the next room, don't look. Just pull the covers over your head and wait for the sun to come up. Because once you see it, you can never forget it, and the green light stays in your eyes forever. The house is quiet now, and I can hear the clock ticking on the wall. It's almost time for me to go to bed, and I'm already starting to feel that familiar tightness in my chest. I'll make sure the door is shut, and the hallway light is on. I don't want to see any more green shadows tonight. I just want to have a normal sleep without wondering if those long, jointed fingers are reaching for the handle of my door. I didn't think much of it until a few years later, when my family moved into a bigger house across town. I thought the move would finally help me leave that green shadow behind, but the memory of those deformed hands felt like a stain on my brain that wouldn't wash away. Even in the new house, I started to notice things that felt off. It wasn't that I saw the figure again right away, but the feeling of being watched returned. It was like a cold static in the air, a hum that I could only hear when the house was completely silent. I started to wonder if the thing from the kitchen hadn't just been a visitor, but something that had attached itself to me. Looking back, the most confusing part was how my parents acted. They were always so practical and grounded, talking about bills and work and the weather. I would sit at the breakfast table, eating my cereal and looking into the very kitchen where I had seen the monster, and they would be laughing about a joke they heard on the radio. It made me feel like I was living in a different reality than them. I wanted to scream and ask them how they could be so calm when something so wrong had been standing right where the toaster was. But the words always got stuck in my throat, and I just kept eating, keeping my eyes on my bowl. That's when things changed in my dreams. The green figure began to show up more often, but now it was closer. In the dreams, I would be back in my old room, but the door would be wide open. I would try to get up to close it, but my legs felt like they were made of stone. The green light would start to bleed into the room from the kitchen, casting long, distorted shadows on my walls. I could hear a sound like dry paper being crumpled, a slow and rhythmic noise that I realized was the creature moving its long, jointed fingers. It never spoke, and it never attacked. It just watched, its presence filling me with a sadness that felt older than the world. I started to do research at the school library, looking through books on myths and legends. I searched for anything that mentioned green spirits or forest dwellers, but nothing fit. The creature I saw didn't look like a ghost or a fairy. It looked mechanical in some ways, but biological in others. It was as if someone had tried to build a person out of pieces that didn't fit together. I began to think that maybe it wasn't an alien from space, but something that had always been here, living in the spaces between the walls or under the floorboards. I wondered if every house had one, and if I was just the unlucky kid who woke up at the wrong time. At the time, it felt normal to become a bit obsessed with the light. I would stay awake at night, staring at the gap under my bedroom door, waiting for that faint green glow to appear. I became an expert at hearing the different sounds of the house. I knew the difference between the heater clicking on and the sound of a footstep on the linoleum. My grades started to slip because I was so tired all the time, but I didn't care. I felt like I was a sentry, a guard standing watch over my family. I thought that if I stayed awake, I could keep the green man from coming any closer to my parents or my little brother. Eventually, the stress of the secret became too much to carry. One night, when I was about 13, I finally broke down and told my older cousin about it. We were sitting in the backyard by a fire, and the darkness of the woods felt like it was pressing in on us. I told him about the bathroom trip, the open door, and the deformed hands. I expected him to laugh or tell me I was crazy, but he just stared into the flames for a long time. Then he told me that when he was my age, he had seen something similar in his own house, but his figure had been a deep, bruised purple. He said it only appeared when he was sick or very sad. I fear the future because I realize now that these things might be passed down through families. It wasn't just a random event. It was a glimpse into a part of the world that most people choose to ignore. I wonder if my own children will one day wake up in the middle of the night and see a green light in their kitchen. I wonder if they will have to carry the same heavy silence that I've carried for all these years. The thought of them being that scared and me not being able to protect them is worse than any monster. I still don't know why the figure stayed for only 2 seconds. Part of me thinks it was just as surprised to see me as I was to see it. Maybe it was just a traveler, moving through our house on its way to somewhere else, and it didn't expect a 10-year-old to be awake and staring at it. I think about those deformed hands, and I wonder what they were carrying, or what they were trying to reach for. The image is so sharp in my mind that it feels like it happened yesterday, not years ago. It's a memory that refuses to age, staying bright and terrifying, while everything else from my childhood fades away. I don't go into the kitchen at night without turning on every single light anymore. I've learned that the darkness is only safe when you can't see what's inside it. If you ever find yourself walking through your house in the early morning hours, keep your head down. Don't look into the shadows behind the counter, and don't look through the cracks in the doors. Some things are meant to be hidden, and some visitors aren't looking for a friend. They are just looking for someone to witness them, and once you do, you can never look away. The sun is fully up now, and the house is filled with the normal sounds of the day. I can hear the neighbors mowing their lawn and the birds chirping in the trees. It's easy to feel safe when the world is bright and loud. But I know that in a few hours, the shadows will start to grow again. I'll check the locks on the doors and make sure the bedroom handles are tight. I'll try to have a normal night, but I know that a part of me will always be that 10-year-old boy staring through the door and waiting for the green light to return. I still think about that night whenever I see a flash of green in the corner of my eye. It could be a leaf blowing in the wind or a reflection on a window, but for a split second, my heart stops. I find myself checking my own hands, making sure they look the way they should. I've realized that the real horror isn't that monsters exist, but that they can be so quiet. They don't always come with screams and blood. Sometimes they just stand there, glowing in the dark, and change your life in 2 seconds. Story number 4. I don't have a very clear memory of everything that happened during my 3rd grade year, but the events of that one spring break stay with me like a vivid, terrifying movie. I was 8 years old at the time, and since my parents both worked long hours, I spent most of my school breaks at the YMCA day camp held at my elementary school. It was usually a fun time because the school felt different when it was mostly empty. We had the run of the cafeteria and the big playground out back. The walk from the cafeteria to the playground was actually quite long, taking us past the back of the gym and along a tall chain link fence that separated the school grounds from a patch of dense woods and a public walking trail. The day started out like any other. The sun was warm, and the teachers decided to take us outside for an hour of fresh air. There were about 20 of us on the playground that morning, mostly kids my age who just wanted to run around and burn off some energy. My best friend, Leo, and I were busy playing a game of tag near the swings. The rest of the teachers and the older students who didn't want to go out were deep inside the building, probably in the gym or the library. We were isolated, but back then, the schoolyard felt like the safest place in the world. We knew that the only way back into the school was through the heavy double doors of the cafeteria, and those were always kept locked from the outside for safety. At the time, it felt normal to see people walking their dogs on the trail behind the fence. I remember glancing over and seeing a woman in a bright blue jacket walking a small golden retriever. She was moving at a casual pace until she got to a specific section of the fence that was tucked behind some large oak trees. Suddenly, she stopped dead in her tracks. She stood there for a second, staring into the brush, and then she turned around and started walking toward our group at an incredibly fast pace. She wasn't just walking, she was almost jogging, and her face was pale, like she had just seen something that didn't make sense. She made a straight line for our main YMCA teacher, Mrs. Gable, who was standing near the slide. I was close enough to hear their conversation, though I kept pretending to play with Leo. The woman's voice was shaking as she told Mrs. Gable that there was a man hiding behind the fence in the woods. She said the man had reached through the wire and hit her dog as she walked by. But that wasn't the worst part. She whispered that she saw something long and dark sitting on the ground right next to him, and she was almost certain it was a rifle. My teacher's face didn't just change, it completely froze, turning a dusty shade of white. That's when things changed on the playground. Mrs. Gable didn't hesitate. She reached for the whistle around her neck and blew the specific YMCA emergency call. 3 sharp, loud blasts that meant everyone had to stop what they were doing and get into a line immediately. Usually, we were slow to follow orders, but there was something in the way she blew that whistle that made every kid freeze. We scrambled into a single file line, but there was one kid, a younger boy named Toby, who was still at the very top of the jungle gym. He was looking off into the distance, completely unaware of the panic starting to bubble up among the adults. Leo and I followed Toby's gaze toward the far end of the fence. About 50 yards away, near the thickest part of the woods, we saw him. There was a man dressed in dark, baggy clothes standing on the other side of the tall wire mesh. He wasn't just standing there watching us anymore. He reached up and grabbed the top of the fence, pulling himself upward with a terrifying amount of strength. This fence was nearly 10 feet tall, but he was climbing it like it was nothing. I remember seeing a dark shape slung over his shoulder, something heavy that clattered against the metal as he climbed. It looked exactly like the weapon the woman had described. Mrs. Gable saw him too, and she didn't wait for Toby to get down on his own. She screamed at us to run. She didn't tell us to walk or stay in line anymore. She just pointed at the cafeteria doors and told us to go as fast as we could. We took off across the blacktop, my sneakers pounding against the pavement so hard I could feel the vibration in my teeth. The distance to the cafeteria felt like miles instead of yards. Every time I looked over my shoulder, I could see the man reaching the top of the fence, his silhouette sharp against the bright spring sky. I felt a cold knot of terror in my stomach, wondering if we would make it to the doors before he hit the ground on our side. We reached the cafeteria doors and started banging on the glass with our fists. We were screaming for the teachers inside to let us in, our voices cracking with fear. For a few heart-pounding seconds, no one appeared. We were trapped in the little alcove by the doors, 20 kids and one terrified teacher, while a man with a gun was potentially running across the field behind us. I remember looking at Leo, and his eyes were so wide I could see the white all the way around them. Finally, we saw the janitor, Mr. Henderson, running through the cafeteria. He saw our faces and realized something was wrong. He threw the doors open, and we spilled inside like water. Looking back, the silence of the cafeteria was the weirdest part. We were all gasping for air, leaning against the long folding tables, while Mr. Henderson slammed the locks into place. Mrs. Gable was already on her walkie-talkie, calling for the principal and the police. We were led away from the windows and taken upstairs to the main office area, where the principal was waiting. The building was put into a full lockdown. I sat on the floor of the carpeted office, listening to the muffled sounds of the police sirens getting closer and closer. I kept thinking about the man on the fence and wondering why he wanted to come into our school. The police arrived at the school in what felt like seconds, their blue and red lights reflecting off the hallway trophies. We were huddled in the principal's office, sitting in a circle on the floor while the adults spoke in low, urgent whispers. I remember looking at the clock on the wall and realizing it had only been 20 minutes since we were outside, but it felt like an entire day had passed. The principal, a tall man who usually had a booming laugh, looked smaller now, his shoulders hunched as he walked back and forth near the window. He kept telling us that we were safe and that the school was like a fortress, but I couldn't stop thinking about how easily that man had scaled the fence. Officers began to spread out across the property, their heavy boots thumping on the roof and in the corridors. We heard the janitor, Mr. Henderson, talking to them about the different entrances and exits, his voice sounding tight and stressed. The police had one officer stay with us in the office while the others went out into the woods with a K-9 unit. I watched the officer's belt, mesmerized by all the gear he carried, trying to focus on anything other than the image of the man in the baggy clothes. I wondered if he was still out there, hiding in the bushes, waiting for the officers to leave so he could try again. At the time, it felt normal to expect that they would find him immediately. In the movies, the bad guy always gets caught within the first few minutes of the chase. But as the hour mark passed, the officers came back into the building looking frustrated. They had searched the woods, the public trail, and every inch of the playground, but the man had simply vanished. They found some flattened grass where it looked like someone had been sitting for a long time, and they found a few scratches on the metal of the fence. But there was no sign of the man or the weapon he was carrying. It was as if he had evaporated into the spring air. That's when things changed in my mind about how safe I really was. Up until that day, I believed that bad things only happened in far away places or in the news. But seeing that man climb into our world, into our playground, made the world feel very small and very dangerous. The police stayed at the school for the rest of the day, patrolling the halls and sitting in the parking lot, but the tension never really left the building. My parents came to pick me up early, and I remember my mom hugging me so hard it was difficult to breathe. She didn't say much, but I could tell she had been crying on the way over. Looking back, the mystery of who he was is the part that keeps me awake at night. The police never found anyone matching the description in the neighborhood, and the woman with the dog never saw him again either. There were no reports of stolen guns or suspicious people in the area before that morning. It was like he had appeared just for us, just to see if he could get over that fence. I find myself wondering what would happen if Toby hadn't gotten down in time, or if the cafeteria doors had been stuck. Those few seconds of banging on the glass feel like they lasted a lifetime, and I can still hear the sound of the locks clicking into place. I went back to that school for 2 more years, but I never played near that fence again. Every time we went out for recess, I would find myself staring at the edge of the woods, looking for a dark silhouette or the glint of metal in the sun. My friends eventually stopped talking about it, moving on to newer games and different interests, but I stayed quiet. I noticed that the school eventually added more security cameras and a higher, sturdier fence, but to me, it always felt like a band-aid on a deep wound. Once you know that someone is watching from the trees, you never really feel alone in a wide, open space. I fear the future, because I realize that there are people in the world who don't need a reason to be cruel. That man didn't know us, and we didn't know him, yet he was willing to climb into a yard full of children with a weapon in his hand. I wonder where he went after he jumped down. And if he ever went to another school to try the same thing. I think about the woman with the dog and how lucky we were that she decided to run toward us instead of away. If she hadn't spoken up, we might have stayed on that playground until it was too late. I still don't know why the police couldn't find a single footprint or a trace of where he went. The woods behind the school weren't that big, and the trail led directly into a residential area. Someone should have seen a man running with a rifle, or at least a suspicious car driving away in a hurry. The lack of answers makes the memory feel even more like a nightmare than a real event. It's like a puzzle with a missing piece, and no matter how many times I turn the memory over in my head, I can't make it fit into a logical story. I don't go to parks or schools during the quiet hours of the day anymore. I've learned that the places meant for play can become the most dangerous places of all when no one is around to watch. If you ever find yourself in a wide, open field and the air suddenly feels still, take a look at the perimeter. Don't assume the fence is enough to keep the world out, and don't assume that help is just a door away. Some people spend their whole lives looking for an opening, and they are much faster than you think. The school has been remodeled since then, and the old cafeteria doors have been replaced with a new, high-tech entry system. I drove past it a few months ago, and I saw a group of kids playing tag in the exact same spot where Leo and I had stood. They looked so happy and so sure of their safety. I wanted to stop and tell them to keep an eye on the woods, to tell them about the man who climbed the fence, but I just kept driving. I realized that they deserve to have their spring break with the weight of my memories. I still think about the look on Mrs. Gable's face when the woman whispered to her. It was the first time I realized that adults can be just as scared as kids. Sometimes I hear a whistle blow in the distance, and for a split second, I'm 8 years old again, running across the blacktop with my heart in my throat. I check the locks on my house every night, and I always make sure I know where the exits are. Because I know that out there, somewhere, there are people who are still climbing. Story number 5. I have a very specific way of doing things when the sun goes down. Most people just crawl into bed and fall asleep. but I have a routine that I never break. The most important part of that routine is my bedroom door. I have to sleep with it closed. It is not because I am afraid of monsters or anything like that. I have just been doing it since I was a little kid. I like the way the room feels when it is shut off from the rest of the house. It feels quiet and private. I like knowing that there is a solid piece of wood between me and the dark hallway. For a long time, this worked perfectly. I never had a reason to think twice about it until a few weeks ago. It was a Monday night, and I remember feeling very tired. I did my usual check of the house, turned off the kitchen light, and walked into my room. I pulled the door shut behind me, and I distinctly remember hearing the soft click of the latch. I climbed into bed, pulled my blanket up to my chin, and fell asleep almost instantly. But around 2 in the morning, I woke up. It was not a loud noise or a nightmare that woke me. It was just that strange feeling you get when the air in the room changes. I opened my eyes and looked toward the foot of my bed. The door was open. It was only open about 2 inches, just enough to show a dark line of the hallway. At the time, it felt normal to just assume I was clumsy. I figured I had not pulled the handle hard enough, and the latch had just slipped. I got out of bed, feeling the cold floor on my feet, and pushed the door shut again. I made sure to listen for the click this time. I went back to sleep and did not think about it for the rest of the night. But the next night, it happened again. I woke up at nearly the same time, and when I looked over, the door was open a little further than before. This time it was open about 4 or 5 inches. I could see the edge of the hallway wall and the dark space where the linen closet is. I sat up in bed and rubbed my eyes. I started thinking about the house itself. It is an old building, and the floors are definitely not straight. I thought maybe the house was settling, or the air pressure from an open window downstairs was sucking the door open. It made sense in my head. I walked over, closed the door again, and this time I really shoved it. I even turned the handle back and forth to make sure it was stuck. I went back to bed, but I did not fall asleep as easily. I lay there for a while, staring at the wood in the dark, waiting to see if it would move. It stayed still, so eventually I drifted off. By the third night, I was starting to pay much more attention. I made it a point to check the door 3 times before I got into bed. I even wiped the door frame to make sure there was no dust or grease, making it slippery. I went to sleep feeling like I had solved the problem. But when I woke up around 3 in the morning, the door was wide open. It was not just a crack this time. It was open enough that I could see halfway down the hallway. The hall light was off, so it was very dark out there, but I could see the faint shapes of the picture frames on the wall. I stayed in bed for a long time, just watching that dark opening. I didn't think much of it until I realized how quiet the house was. Usually you can hear the heater hum or the crickets outside, but it felt like the whole world had gone silent. I walked to the door and stood in the frame, looking out into the hall. I didn't see anyone, and I didn't hear any footsteps. I closed the door and stayed there for a second with my hand on the knob. I was listening for anything on the other side. I wanted to hear a breath or a floorboard creak, but there was nothing. It was like I was the only person left on Earth. I went back to bed, but I left my bedside lamp on for the rest of the night. The next evening, I decided to start locking the door. My bedroom has one of those old-fashioned privacy locks where you just turn a little button on the handle. I turned the lock and tried to pull the door open from the inside. It wouldn't budge. I felt much better after that. I thought that if the door was opening because of the house shifting, the lock would definitely stop it. I fell asleep feeling safe. But a few hours later, I woke up with that same itchy feeling on my skin. I looked at the door. It was still closed, which made me feel relieved for a split second. But then I saw the handle. The silver handle was turned downward at a slight angle. It was not turned all the way, but it was enough to show that someone or something had put pressure on it. It was like someone had tried to turn it, realized it was locked, and then just held it there. I stared at that handle for a long time, waiting for it to move back up to its normal position. It stayed tilted down. I realized then that this was not about air pressure or uneven floors. A house shifting does not turn a door handle. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, sitting up against my headboard with my eyes fixed on that silver handle. That's when things changed for me. I realized I couldn't just ignore this anymore. The next night, I decided to use a chair. I took the heavy wooden chair from my desk and wedged the top of it right under the door handle. I also locked the door. I thought there was no way anything was getting in now. If someone tried to push the door, the chair would scratch the floor and make a huge noise that would wake me up instantly. I went to bed feeling like I had built a wall. I was exhausted from not sleeping, so I fell into a very deep sleep almost as soon as my head hit the pillow. I woke up around 4 in the morning. The first thing I noticed was that the room felt very cold. I looked toward the door and my heart nearly stopped. The chair was lying on its side in the middle of the room. It had not just slipped, it was several feet away from the door, as if it had been picked up and set down there. The door itself was shut, but the little lock button was turned to the open position. I know I locked it. I remember checking it twice before I put the chair there. The worst part was that I hadn't heard a thing. No crash of the chair, no click of the lock. Just total, heavy silence. I started to feel a type of fear that I had never felt before. It was not a sudden scare like a jump in a movie. It was a slow, heavy dread that felt like it was filling up my lungs. I realized that whatever was doing this was very patient. It was not trying to rush in and hurt me. It was just moving the door a little bit more every night, like it was testing me. It wanted to see how I would react. It was like a game to whatever was on the other side of that wood. I stopped sleeping in the dark after that. I turned on every light in the bedroom, but even the bright light did not make the room feel any warmer. For the next few days, I was a wreck. I couldn't focus at work, and I kept looking over my shoulder whenever I was in a room alone. I started wondering if I was losing my mind. I searched the internet for stories about doors opening on their own, but most of them talked about ghosts or demons. I didn't want to believe in that stuff. I wanted a logical reason. But the chair on the floor was not logical. I started to think that maybe I was doing it in my sleep. Maybe I was getting up, unlocking the door, moving the chair, and then going back to bed without knowing it. It was the only thing that made any sense. To prove it to myself, I set up a small camera on my bookshelf. I pointed it right at the door. That night, I did the whole routine again. I locked the door and put the chair back. I went to bed, feeling a little bit better knowing that the camera would show me the truth in the morning. If I was sleepwalking, I could get help. If it was something else, I would finally have proof. I fell asleep, and for the first time in a week, I didn't wake up until the sun was coming through the curtains. I felt great. I grabbed the camera and sat down on my bed to watch the footage. The video started out normal. It showed me getting into bed and turning off the lamp. For the first 3 hours, nothing happened. I could see myself tossing and turning a little bit, but that was it. Then, at exactly 3:22 a.m., the video started to get grainy. It was like there was a lot of static on the screen. I watched as the door handle slowly began to turn. The chair did not move at first, but then it began to slide across the floor. It didn't tip over. It slid smoothly, as if someone was pushing it out of the way with their foot. Then, the door opened about an inch. I watched the screen, waiting to see a hand or a shadow come through the crack, but nothing appeared. The door stayed open an inch for about 10 minutes. Then, it opened another inch. This went on for the rest of the night. Every 10 or 15 minutes, the door would move just a tiny bit more. It was so slow that if you were watching it in real life, you might not even notice it was moving at all. By the end of the video, the door was open wide enough for someone to walk through. I never saw a person. I never saw a shadow. I just saw the door moving by itself in a room full of static. I felt like I couldn't breathe. I watched the end of the video over and over, looking for any sign of a person. I looked at the bottom of the door to see if there were feet, but there was nothing but the dark hallway. I realized then that my sleepwalking theory was wrong. I had stayed in bed the whole night. I saw myself sleeping on the camera while the door was moving. Whatever was doing this was not me, and it was not something that the camera could see clearly. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. I was living in a house with something that was very, very patient. The next night, I was too afraid to even try to close the door. I left it open and sat on my bed with all the lights on. I had a baseball bat next to me, but I knew it wouldn't do any good against something I couldn't even see on a camera. I stayed awake as long as I could, but eventually, my eyes started to get heavy. I must have drifted off for a second because I woke up to a soft sound. It was a tiny, faint clicking noise. I looked at the door. It was moving. It was not opening or closing. It was just making a small adjustment, a tiny little nudge, like someone was making sure it was in the perfect position. I stared at the opening of the door, and I felt a sudden, sharp realization. The door was not just being opened. It was being positioned so that whoever was in the hallway had a perfect line of sight to my bed. From where the door was sitting, you could see straight down the hallway and all the way into the living room. I realized that every night, the door had been moved just a little bit more to give that hidden viewer a better angle. It had been a slow, careful process to make sure I didn't get too scared too fast. It wanted me to get used to the door being open so it could watch me without me jumping out of bed. I sat there in the bright light of my room, and I felt a wave of absolute terror. I looked down the hallway into the dark living room, and I knew that something was sitting there. It was probably sitting in my favorite armchair, just staring down the long path of the hall, right into my eyes. I didn't move for the rest of the night. I just sat there with my bat, staring back into the darkness, waiting for the sun to save me. I knew then that my life had changed forever. I couldn't just live in this house like a normal person anymore. The sun finally came up that morning, but it didn't bring the relief I was hoping for. The light just showed me how empty my house looked, and that emptiness felt like a lie. I didn't go to work. I stayed on my bed, clutching that baseball bat until my hands cramped. I kept thinking about the video and the way that chair had slid across the floor without making a single sound. I knew that if I stayed in the house, I was going to lose my mind. But a part of me was also afraid to leave. I felt like if I walked out that front door, whatever was in the hallway might decide to follow me to a hotel or a friend's place. I spent the day walking around the house, turning on every single light. I even went into the basement and the attic, opening all the curtains and letting the daylight into every dusty corner. I wanted to prove to myself that there was nothing there. The living room looked normal. My armchair was empty. The TV was off. Everything was exactly where it should be. But when I stood in the living room and looked toward my bedroom, I saw exactly what the door had been framing. From that specific spot in the living room, you had a perfect, unobstructed view of my pillow. It was chilling to realize that someone had spent a week carefully tuning the door just to get that view. At the time, it felt normal to think about moving. I even looked at some apartment listings on my phone, but I couldn't stop thinking about the chair. If something could move a heavy wooden chair across a room while I was sleeping, a different zip code wasn't going to stop it. I felt like I was tied to this house now, or rather, the house was tied to me. I spent the afternoon sitting on my porch, watching people walk their dogs and kids ride their bikes. They looked so happy and oblivious. I wanted to scream at them to go home and lock their doors, but I knew I would just sound like a crazy person. That's when things changed in my behavior. I stopped fighting the door. That evening, as the sun started to set and the shadows began to grow long again. I didn't reach for the handle. I didn't look for the chair. I walked into my bedroom, and I pushed the door as wide as it would go. I made sure it was pressed firmly against the wall. Then, I went into the living room, and I turned on the big overhead light. I also turned on the kitchen light and the lamp in the hallway. I wanted to make the house so bright that there wasn't a single patch of darkness left for anything to sit in. I sat in my bed and tried to read a book, but I couldn't focus on the words. Every few seconds, my eyes would dart to the doorway. I was waiting for the light in the hallway to flicker or for a shadow to cross the floor. About 2 hours in, the living room light went out. I didn't hear a click of a switch. The room just went dark. A few seconds later, the kitchen light followed. One by one, the lights in my house were being extinguished, moving closer and closer to my bedroom. I sat there, frozen, as the hallway lamp finally went dark, leaving only my bedside lamp burning. I looked into the hallway, and it was blacker than I had ever seen it. It was a thick, heavy kind of dark that felt like it had weight. I kept my eyes fixed on the living room, which was now just a dark void at the end of the hall. I expected to see eyes or a pale face or the outline of a tall figure. But there was nothing, just the silence. And then the door moved. Since I had pushed it all the way open against the wall, there was nowhere for it to go but shut. It didn't slam. It moved with that same agonizing slowness, inch by inch, swinging back toward the center of the room. I realized then that the game had changed. Before, it wanted the door open so it could see in. Now, it wanted the door closed so I couldn't see out. It didn't want me to see what it was doing in the rest of the house. I jumped out of bed and ran to the door, grabbing the edge of the wood before it could shut. I pushed back against it, but it felt like pushing against a stone wall. There was no person on the other side, no hands to grab, just a solid, unmoving force that wanted that door shut. I screamed at it to leave me alone, but my voice just bounced off the walls of my empty room. I gave up and let go of the door. It finished closing with a soft, gentle click. I stood there in my room, staring at the wood, feeling a level of isolation that I can't describe. I was locked in my own bedroom, and something else was out there, enjoying the rest of my home. I didn't try to open the door again. I went back to my bed and sat in the center of the mattress, away from the edges. I left the lamp on, and I stayed awake until the sun came up. I heard things that night, the sound of my TV turning on and off, the sound of water running in the kitchen, and the sound of someone sitting in my armchair. When morning came, I opened the door and found the house exactly as I had left it. The TV was off. The sinks were dry. The chair was empty. But there was one thing that was different. On the kitchen table, there was a single glass of water. I hadn't put it there. I touched the side of the glass, and it was ice cold, as if it had just been poured. I didn't drink it. I poured it down the drain and left the house for the entire day. I walked around the mall, sat in the park, and stayed in a crowded coffee shop until they closed. I dreaded going back, but I didn't have anywhere else to go. I fear the future because this has become my life now. I live in a house where I am only allowed to use my bedroom. Every night, the lights in the rest of the house go out, and every night, the door is closed for me. I've stopped trying to lock it or block it with furniture. I've realized that as long as I follow the rules, it leaves me alone. It wants the house at night, and it wants me to stay in my room. It feels like I'm a tenant in a place that belongs to something else. I spend my evenings listening to the sounds of someone living a life in my living room while I sit in the dark. I still don't know what would happen if I tried to walk out into the hallway in the middle of the night. I've stood at the door with my hand on the knob, but my heart always starts to race so fast that I feel like I'm going to pass out. I'm afraid that if I open that door, I'll see something that I wasn't meant to see. Or worse, I'm afraid that I'll find the hallway is gone and there's nothing but a black pit waiting for me. I've decided that I'm not brave enough to find out. I'll just stay in my room and wait for the sun. I've started to notice that the adjustments are happening in the daytime now, too. I'll leave a room and come back to find the curtains drawn, chair moved a few inches to the left. It's like it's getting more comfortable, more confident. It's not hiding as much as it used to. I've stopped looking for a logical explanation. There is no air pressure or shifting wood that pours a glass of water or turns on a TV. There is just the thing in the house and the way it moves the world around it. I don't think much of my old life anymore. I don't invite people over, and I don't talk to my neighbors. I don't want anyone else to get caught in this. I just buy my groceries, go to work, and come home to my bedroom. I've accepted that this is how things are going to be. Sometimes I find myself talking to the door, telling it that I'm going to sleep and that I won't come out until morning. It sounds crazy, but it makes me feel a little bit safer, like I'm keeping up my end of the bargain. I wonder if one day the door won't open in the morning. I wonder if I'll wake up and find that the sun hasn't come up and that the door is locked from the other side. That is my biggest fear, that the bedroom will stop being my sanctuary and start being my cage. But for now, the door still opens when the birds start to chirp. I get my few hours of freedom before the cycle starts all over again. I just have to keep following the rules. The sun is starting to go down again, and I can feel the air in the house getting colder. I'm going to go into my room now and wait for the click of the latch. I've learned to live with the silence, and I've learned to live with the dark. If you ever move into an old house and the doors start to move, don't fight it. Just find a room you like and stay there, because the house is much bigger than you are, and it has all the time in the world to wait. I think I hear the living room light go out. It's time for me to go. I hope that tonight is a quiet night. I hope that whatever is sitting in my chair is satisfied with just watching the hallway. I'll see you in the morning, if the door opens. Story number 6. I have spent a lot of my life in my grandmother's estate, a massive stone house in the rolling hills of the English countryside that has been standing for at least 100 years. It is a giant place, built with thick gray walls and high ceilings that make every footstep echo. There are parts of the house that feel like they belong to a different century entirely. The second floor is particularly strange. It has a large balcony area with no roof, surrounded by long, imposing stone walls. My grandmother, Eleanor, passed away recently, and she took many of the house's secrets with her. But there was one story she told me back in 2021 that stays with me every time I walk up those creaking stairs. It was a warm evening a few years ago when I brought 2 of my friends, Sarah and Chloe, over to the estate. We were young and looking for a thrill, so we decided to play some of those scary games you find on the internet. Since the house is so big and only my great-grandmother and her housekeeper lived there at the time, we had plenty of privacy. We eventually wandered into a small, cramped room at the end of the hall that we called the nursery. This room was mostly used for storage now, filled with old trunks, broken toys, and layers of dust, but it had 2 mirrors hanging on parallel walls directly opposite each other. To a group of curious teenagers, it seemed like the perfect place to try and summon something. I convinced my friends to play a game called Bloody Mary. Sarah didn't believe in any of that stuff and kept making jokes, but Chloe was very traditional and a bit of a scaredy cat. She was terrified of anything paranormal, but I talked her into it anyway. We stood in the narrow space between the 2 mirrors, our shoulders touching in the dark, and whispered the name 3 times into the glass. I told Chloe not to open her eyes no matter what happened, but she couldn't help herself. She let out a scream that was so loud and sharp it seemed to vibrate the glass in the window frames. When we all opened our eyes, she was shaking, claiming she had seen a woman in an old-fashioned white dress standing right behind us in the reflection. That's when things changed for us that evening. The scream had brought my aunt, who lived in the east wing, running up the stairs. She was the one who looked after the house, and she was furious to find us in the old nursery. She had always told us to stay out of there because it was dirty and full of old junk. But the look on her face that day told me there was another reason. She looked more scared than angry. She shooed us out and told us to go play downstairs in the kitchen. My friends left about an hour later, but I stayed behind to spend a little more time with my great-grandmother before heading to my own house, just a short walk down the road. I went to the library to find a book, and my great-grandmother, who we called Nana, called me over to her chair. She looked very serious, her eyes tracking my every move. She told me that she had heard about what we did in the nursery, and that I must never, ever do it again. I tried to argue that it was just a silly game, but she stopped me with a look that felt heavy with age and sadness. She sat me down and began to tell me a story from the late 1980s, back when my own father, James, was just a little boy of 5 or 6. She spoke slowly, and I could tell she remembered every single detail like it happened yesterday. Back then, the estate was full of people. My great-grandfather was a very strict man, and he kept the family under a very tight thumb. One night, around 9 o'clock, my father was playing with a neighbor girl who had come over after finishing her schoolwork. My father realized he had left some of his favorite toy soldiers in a cupboard on the second floor, right near the entrance to that old nursery. He ran upstairs alone to grab them, thinking he would be back in a minute. It had been exactly 7 days since his own great-grandmother, a woman named Margaret, had passed away. Margaret had lived in that nursery for years toward the end of her life, and since her funeral, the family had kept the door shut. At the time, it felt normal for a kid to be a little bit afraid of a dark hallway, but my father was a brave boy. He didn't think about ghosts or spirits. He just wanted his toys so he could finish his game. But when he got to the top of the stairs, he saw that the door to the nursery was standing wide open. He didn't think much of it at first, assuming the housekeeper had gone in to air out the room. As he reached into the cupboard for his toy soldiers, he heard a voice calling his name from inside the room. It was a soft, loving voice that he recognized instantly as his great-grand Margaret. He turned around and saw her sitting in her favorite high-backed wooden chair, right in the middle of the empty room. My father was so young that the concept of death hadn't really sunk in yet. He just knew that the lady who was always in that room had been missing for a few days, and now she was back. He walked into the room, and she beckoned him closer, calling him, "My sweet boy," in her shaky voice. She picked him up and sat him on her lap, asking him how his day was and if he had eaten his supper. When he told her he was waiting until after he finished playing, she smiled. Suddenly, as if by magic, she produced a plate of hot buttered toast and jam out of thin air. It was his favorite snack, and it smelled just like she used to make it. She began to feed him, at first very slowly and lovingly. But then, the rhythm of the room seemed to shift. She started shoving the toast into his mouth faster and faster. My father tried to tell her he was full, but she didn't listen. Her eyes stayed fixed on him, and that loving smile never left her face, even as she began to stuff the food down his throat with terrifying force. He started to choke, his small hands scratching at her thin arms to make her stop, but she was impossibly strong. He felt like he was drowning in the food. He finally managed to let out a muffled, desperate scream that was so loud it reached the kitchen, all the way on the ground floor. My great-grandmother heard the scream and ran upstairs as fast as her legs could carry her. When she burst into the nursery, she found my father lying on the floor in the center of the room, gasping for air and crying hysterically. There was no one else there. No Margaret, no plate of toast, no jam. But what made her blood run cold was the chair. Sitting right there in the middle of the room, facing the mirrors, was the old wooden chair that had belonged to Margaret. This was the same chair my great Grandfather had been sitting in downstairs just moments before, reading his newspaper. The family had gone against the advice of the local priest and kept that chair after the funeral instead of getting rid of it. My great-grandmother looked at her husband, who had followed her upstairs, and saw that he was just as terrified as she was. He knew he had been sitting in that chair seconds ago. They realized then that whatever was in that room wasn't just a memory of a loved one. It was something that used the memories of the dead to lure in the living. From that day on, the nursery was treated like a tomb, a place that was never to be entered. I didn't think much of the story until the night Nina died in May of this year. She passed away in the hospital, and the house felt colder than ever when we returned. That night, the estate was crowded with relatives who had come for the funeral. I was sleeping in a bedroom near the west staircase, curled up next to my father. I fell into a deep, heavy sleep, and I had a dream that felt far too real. I dreamed that Nana walked into the room. She was walking with ease, her back straight, even though she had used a walker for the last 10 years of her life. She came over to the bed and sat near my feet. She looked at me with such clarity and asked if I had fallen asleep yet. I tried to answer, but I couldn't move or speak. Then she leaned in and whispered, "One final warning. Stay away from the nursery." She stood up and walked out through the balcony door into the night air. I woke up the instant she vanished, my heart racing against my ribs. I checked my phone to see the time, and it was exactly 3:44 a.m. I had heard people say that this is the hour when the dead can speak most clearly to the living. Looking back, I realized that even on her deathbed, when her mind was slipping, and she couldn't even recognize her own kids, she still remembered to be afraid of that room. She had lived in that estate for most of her life, and she knew every corner of it. Yet the nursery was the one place she feared until her final breath. It makes me wonder what else happened in there over the decades. Was it just the incident with my father, or had she seen something even more horrifying that she never told a soul? I wonder if the woman Sarah and Chloe saw in the mirror that evening was the same one who tried to choke my father. The thought that something is still standing in that storage room, waiting between two parallel mirrors, makes me never want to set foot on the second floor again. My relatives told me that my dream was just Nana saying goodbye, but I can't shake the feeling that she was giving me a permanent warning. She wanted to make sure that the curiosity that led me to play games with mirrors wouldn't eventually lead me to the same fate my father almost met. I fear the future because the estate is still standing and the nursery is still full of old things that no one wants to touch. The mirrors are still hanging on the walls, facing each other, creating an infinite loop of reflections that could hide anything. Nana is gone now, and the house feels quieter, but also emptier in a way that feels dangerous. Sometimes, when I'm downstairs, I think I hear the sound of a wooden chair scraping against the floorboards upstairs, even when I know the second floor is empty. I didn't think much of the scratching sounds at first. In an old house like my grandmother's estate, you get used to the walls talking to you. You tell yourself it is just squirrels in the eaves or the wood expanding in the night air. But after Nana's funeral, the sounds in the nursery changed. They stopped being random. They started to sound like someone was pacing back and forth, dragging something heavy across the floorboards. I would stand at the bottom of the stairs in the middle of the night, clutching a glass of water, and listen to the rhythmic thud scrape coming from right above my head. My father, James, didn't like to talk about it. Whenever I brought up the room, or the story Nana told me, he would suddenly find a reason to leave the room. He had a scar on the side of his neck that he claimed was from a childhood accident, but I noticed he always covered it with his hand whenever he walked past the nursery door. He had become quiet and jumpy, often staring at the ceiling as if he could see through the plaster to whatever was moving around up there. It felt like the house was holding its breath, waiting for one of us to make a mistake. That's when things changed in the way I saw my own family. I started to realize that everyone was keeping a secret. I found my aunt in the kitchen one morning, staring at a stack of old photographs. When I looked over her shoulder, I saw they were all pictures of the nursery from different years. In every single photo, the two mirrors were draped in black cloth. She told me that for as long as she could remember, the women of the house were tasked with making sure those mirrors stayed covered. She wouldn't tell me why, only that some reflections aren't meant to be seen by human eyes. I started to wonder if the game we played, Sarah, Chloe, and I, had done something more than just scare us. By saying that name 3 times between the two mirrors, we had uncovered them. We had left them bare, facing each other, creating that endless tunnel of light and shadow. I felt a deep sense of guilt, wondering if I had invited the woman in the white dress back into our world. Every night I stayed in that house, I felt the air getting thinner and colder. It felt like the nursery was expanding, its darkness leaking out from under the door and staining the rest of the hallway. At the time, it felt normal to want to fix what I had broken. I thought that if I could just go back into that room and cover the mirrors again, the sounds would stop and my father would be able to sleep. I waited until a Saturday afternoon when the house was mostly empty. My aunt was out in the garden and my father was in town running errands. The sun was shining brightly through the downstairs windows, making the fear of the night feel like a distant memory. I grabbed 2 thick bedsheets from the linen closet and made my way up the stairs, my heart thumping against my ribs. The hallway was silent, but the air felt heavy, like walking through water. When I reached the nursery door, I noticed a thin line of gray dust on the floor, as if something had been scratching at the wood from the inside. I reached for the handle, and for a second, I thought I felt it turn on its own. I pushed the door open, and the first thing I noticed was the smell. It didn't smell like old toys or dust anymore. It smelled like damp earth and stagnant water. The room was freezing, despite the warm sun outside. I walked into the center of the room, my boots clicking loudly on the bare floor. The 2 mirrors were right where we had left them, their surfaces gleaming with a dull, silver light. I walked toward the first one, holding up the sheet, but I stopped when I saw my reflection. It wasn't just me standing there. The background of the room in the mirror was different. It didn't show the trunks or the broken toys. It showed a nursery that was perfectly clean, with a burning fireplace and a rocking horse that was moving back and forth on its own. I looked over my shoulder, but the real room was still a mess of storage and dust. I looked back at the mirror, and that's when I saw her. The woman in the white dress was sitting in the high, backed wooden chair, right where my father had seen her decades ago. She wasn't looking at me, she was looking at the mirror on the opposite wall. Because the mirrors faced each other, I could see her. Reflection repeating forever into the distance. 1,000 versions of the same woman, all sitting perfectly still. Looking back, I should have run right then, but I was mesmerized by the way the reflections moved. In the second reflection down the line, she was standing up. In the third, she was walking toward the glass. In the fourth, she was pressing her hands against the surface. It was like a movie playing out in slow motion through the infinite tunnel of the mirrors. I felt a cold hand wrap around my ankle, and I looked down to see a pale, thin arm reaching out from the bottom of the frame. It wasn't a solid arm. It looked like it was made of smoke and silver light. I screamed and kicked out, dropping the sheets and scrambling toward the door. But the door didn't lead to the hallway anymore. When I looked through the doorway, I didn't see the stairs or the library. I saw another version of the nursery, and then another, and another. I was trapped in the loop of the mirrors. I turned around and saw the woman in the white dress standing in the center of the room. She was much taller than a normal person, her head nearly touching the ceiling. Her face was a blur of gray features, except for her mouth, which was open in a wide, silent grin. She reached out and grabbed my shoulders, her fingers feeling like icicles poking through my shirt. She didn't try to feed me like she had with my father. She just started to pull me toward the mirror. I felt my feet leave the floor, and the glass began to ripple like water as I got closer. I tried to scream for Nana, for my father, for anyone, but the air in the room was so cold that my breath hitched in my throat. Just as my face was inches from the glass, I heard a loud, booming sound, like a gunshot. The mirror on the opposite wall shattered into a million pieces. My aunt was standing in the doorway, holding a heavy iron fireplace poker. She had smashed the glass, breaking the infinite loop. The woman in the white dress let out a sound like steam escaping a pipe and vanished into a cloud of gray mist. The room suddenly felt warmer, and the heavy weight in the air lifted. I fell to the floor, gasping for air, while my aunt rushed over and pulled me out into the hallway. She slammed the nursery door shut and locked it with a heavy key I had never seen before. I spent the next 3 days in bed with a fever. My father sat by my side the whole time, his eyes full of a sadness that I finally understood. He told me that Margaret hadn't been a bad person when she was alive, but she had been obsessed with the mirrors. She believed they were a doorway to a place where no one ever got old and no one ever died. After she passed, that obsession had turned into something hungry. The room wasn't just a room. It was a trap she had built for herself, and she was always looking for someone to keep her company in the silver silence of the reflections. I fear the future because the estate is being sold next month. My father and aunt decided that it is time to let the house go. They are going to clear out the nursery and take the old trunks, but they are leaving the broken glass and the one remaining mirror behind. I worry about the people who will move in next. They will see the old nursery and think it is a charming place for their own children. They won't know about the woman in the white dress or the way the mirrors can stretch a room until there is no way out. I still don't know why the loop was so easy to break with a fireplace poker. Part of me thinks that maybe it wasn't broken at all, but just paused. I sometimes have dreams where I am standing in a room made entirely of glass, and I can see my aunt and father on the other side, but they can't hear me. I wake up with the taste of buttered toast in my mouth, even when there is none in the house. I wonder if a piece of me stayed behind in that silver tunnel, wandering through the reflections of a house that no longer exists. I stay away from mirrors now, especially when they are across from each other. I've learned that our eyes only see a tiny fraction of what is actually standing in the room with us. If you ever find yourself in an old estate and you feel a chill in a room full of dust, don't stay to investigate. Don't look too closely at your own reflection, and never ever say a name into the glass. Some doors are made of wood and iron, but others are made of light and silver, and those are much harder to keep locked. The sun is setting on the estate for the last time today. We have packed up the final boxes, and the moving truck is waiting in the driveway. I took one last look at the nursery window from the garden, and for a split second, I thought I saw a flash of white behind the glass. It might have been a reflection of a cloud, or it might have been her, waiting for the next group of curious children to find the key. I got into the car and didn't look back. I just want to live in a house with small windows and no mirrors. I think my father feels the same way. He hasn't stopped looking in the rearview mirror since we pulled out of the driveway, but he isn't looking at the road. He's looking at the empty seat next to him, making sure no one else decided to hitch a ride. We are heading toward the city now, toward the noise and the lights. I hope the shadows there aren't as long as they are in the countryside. I hope the only reflections I see from now on are the ones that belong to me. Story number 7. I moved into the house because nothing about it stood out. That might sound strange, but after years of apartment living, I wanted something forgettable. A place where days blended together. A place that didn't demand attention. The street was quiet in the way suburban streets usually are. Long stretches of pavement, evenly spaced mailboxes, and the kind of trees that look identical in every season except autumn. If you stood at one end and looked down the road, there was nothing to catch your eye. That felt safe. The house itself was small but solid. 2 bedrooms, 1 bath, a narrow kitchen that opened into the living room. No basement, no attic you could stand up in. Everything felt practical. I told myself I could live there for years, without forming any strong memories at all. The neighbor to my left had already been there when I arrived. I didn't learn his name right away. We exchanged nods at first. A brief wave when we happened to step outside at the same time. He was quiet, middle-aged, always dressed in the same gray hoodie, even in warmer weather. I assumed he worked nights, just liked routine. Some people are like that. I didn't ask questions. The first thing that stood out wasn't him. It was the light. There was a motion sensor light in his backyard. A bright, white floodlight mounted high on the back of the house. At night, it cut through the darkness like a spotlight. I noticed it only because it turned on without warning. One night, while I was rinsing a glass in my sink, I remember thinking how sensitive it must be. That was all. I didn't think much of it until the night I woke up thirsty. It was sometime after 3 in the morning. I know that because I checked the clock when I couldn't fall back asleep later. The house felt dry, like the air had been sitting still for too long. I walked barefoot into the kitchen, opened the cabinet, and reached for a glass. That's when the light came on. The sudden brightness startled me. I looked up instinctively, straight through my kitchen window and into his backyard. The light washed over the grass, the fence, the edge of his patio, and he was standing there, not moving, not pacing or walking or doing anything that would make sense in the middle of the night, just standing in the center of the yard, facing my house. I waited for him to shift his weight, to look around. He didn't. At the time, it felt easier to assume I was misreading the situation. People do strange things when they sleep. I had read about it before. I told myself he was probably sleepwalking. The hoodie, the stillness, the blank posture. I turned away from the window and went back to bed. Sleep didn't come easily after that. The next night, I didn't mean to check. I told myself I was just being cautious. I moved slowly through the kitchen, keeping my steps light, and glanced out the window. The light flicked on. He was closer. Not by much, just enough that I noticed. This time he stood near the fence that separated our yards. One hand rested against the wood, fingers curled loosely over the top rail. His head was tilted slightly, as if he were listening to something I couldn't hear. I remember holding my breath. The fence wasn't tall. Anyone could lean on it. There was nothing inherently threatening about the posture, but something about the stillness felt deliberate, measured, like waiting. I didn't stay in the kitchen long after that. Over the next few days, I began adjusting my habits without really acknowledging why. I closed the curtains earlier in the evening. I avoided the back windows altogether after sunset. When I took out the trash, I did it before dark. I told myself I was just being practical. Then I noticed the gate. It was open when I got home from work one afternoon. Not wide open, just unlatched, swinging slightly in the breeze. I stood there longer than necessary, staring at it. I always latched that gate. Always. It stuck a little, which meant you had to pull it into place before it would close properly. There was no way it had come undone on its own. I stepped onto the patio to secure it and froze. There were marks on the concrete, not clear footprints, just smudges, irregular impressions where something damp had pressed down and lifted again. They stopped a few feet from my sliding glass door. I crouched, telling myself it could be anything. Mud from a storm, animal tracks distorted by time, but the spacing was wrong, too deliberate. I stood up and noticed the glass. There was a dull smear near the upper portion of the door. Just faint enough that I might have missed it if the light hadn't hit it at the right angle. It looked like a fog patch left by breath, too high. That night, I didn't turn on any lights. I sat on my couch in the dark, phone glowing dimly in my hands. Every sound felt amplified. The refrigerator cycling, the tick of the wall clock, the distant hum of traffic. Then came the scratching. It was slow, faint, intermittent. I told myself it was the oak tree. The branches sometimes brushed the siding when the wind shifted. But the rhythm didn't match the breeze. It came in short, deliberate strokes. Pause. Then again, I didn't move. I don't know how long it lasted. When it stopped, the silence felt heavier than the sound had. The next morning, the smear on the glass was gone. Clean, like it had never been there. I stood in my kitchen for a long time, staring at the reflection of my own face. I didn't recognize the person looking back at me. My eyes were ringed with dark circles. My shoulders sat too high, tense even in stillness. I considered calling someone, a friend, the police. But what would I say? That my neighbor stood in his yard. That my gate was open. That something had brushed against my window. None of it sounded real when framed that way. The following nights blurred together. The light came on more often. Sometimes when I wasn't near the window. Sometimes when I was already lying in bed. I learned not to look directly. The less I acknowledged it, the easier it was to breathe, until the scratching returned. Closer, not at the door this time, along the side of the house. A soft, dragging sound that moved slowly, then stopped. I lay in bed with my eyes open, staring at the ceiling, listening. I didn't sleep much after that. By the end of the week, the house no longer felt like a place I owned. It felt occupied, claimed in a way that paperwork couldn't touch. I started avoiding mirrors, windows, anything that reflected light after dark. That's when I decided I needed answers. I went next door in the afternoon. Daylight has a way of shrinking fear. It pulls shadows back into their corners, makes things feel manageable again. I told myself that if I saw him in the open, everything would fall back into place. The house next door was quieter up close. No decorations, no welcome mat. The windows were bare, curtains drawn tight. I knocked and waited. Nothing. I knocked again. Still nothing. The air smelled faintly damp. Not rotten, just old. Like a place that hadn't been aired out in a long time. I circled toward the backyard, stopping short when I saw the hoodie. It lay crumpled near the fence. Empty. I didn't go any closer. I returned home and locked the door behind me, my hands shaking more than I expected. That night I left the lights on. All of them. The house felt smaller that way, safer, contained. At exactly 3:22 a.m., the lights went out, not all at once, one by one. Living room, kitchen, hallway. I sat on my bed, unmoving, watching the doorway. The door didn't open. It adjusted, just enough to change the angle, to frame the hallway differently. That's when I understood. This wasn't about entering. It was about seeing. Every night, the house was being arranged, subtly, patiently. The way furniture gets nudged over time until a room feels different, but you can't say why. I stopped fighting it. I stayed in my room after dark. Didn't cross the threshold. Didn't look down the hall. I slept with the door closed and the light on. In return, the house stayed quiet. No scratching, no movement. Just the sense of being observed from a distance. A mutual understanding. I don't know what would happen if I broke the pattern. If I opened the door at the wrong time. If I stepped into the hallway after the lights went out. I don't plan to find out. Morning still comes. The door still opens when the sun rises. I move through the house again like nothing happened. But I know better now. Some houses aren't empty at night. Some neighbors don't leave. And some rules exist whether you understand them or not. The light just turned off again. That means it's time. I'll stay where I am.